Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I did not expect a full house for this presentation, so I assume something is full, but thank you for coming. We're going to talk about the devils in the data, the role of data governance and cyber risk mitigation. I added the devils in the data title because, again, data governance, cyber risk mitigation sounds pretty dry, sounds pretty flat. My hope is as we have this conversation, it's anything but that. My name is Ray Ermely. I'm currently the field CISO for Coveware. That's actually a recent change. But most of this presentation is going to be based on my experience as the Chief Information Risk Officer for Pitney Bowes, where I own the data protection, data privacy, data governance, records and information management practices, as well as the cybersecurity enterprise risk. And what I'm going to walk you through today is a little bit of understanding and maybe a slightly different perspective on the data that is actually at risk within your organizations, the nature of the threats against that data, and then different ways to think about maybe how to contain and put guardrails around that information to potentially mitigate what would happen if that data were to be exposed or subject to a data exfiltration attack or any other unauthorized access. So disclaimer, you're going to see a lot of these. You've probably seen a few already this morning. The views of this are obviously my own. They don't represent my current or former employer. And I'm going to try to stay fairly agnostic as we go through. So first, your data at risk. Let me paint a picture, a real-world scenario for each of you. And this, I'm going to change the names to protect the innocent, primarily myself. But you come back into the office on a Monday morning after a very eventful and relaxing weekend, and you're informed by your security teams that there's been some sort of event on the network. And of course, this raises an eyebrow because event on the network and the security teams contacting you usually is never good. And further discussion, it seems that it was an attempt at a ransomware encryption attack. But the IT security teams are fairly celebratory because all their defense in depth and their EDR solutions and their SOC and all the other acronyms that they throw at all of us every day fired and contained the encryption payload. It didn't encrypt any data. There was no disruption. But to be safe, they're bringing in third-party forensics to look at how did they get in, what was patient zero, how did they get as far as they did, and your best response is essentially keep me posted. A few hours pass, and you get the initial bad news. The part of the forensics that's already started has identified that there were scripts that were run days prior to the encryption malware being attempted to be executed that was looking for confidential human resources, finance, M&A, employee-related information in different repositories across your networks. Additionally, there were scripts that were then moving copies of that information from network file shares, not from our crown jewel structured data applications, but network file shares that had fairly open access into staging servers that these attackers now had control over. Additionally, using different file transfer tools, some legitimate, some illegitimate, they were exfiltrating that information days prior, completely unaware from your security teams and your SOC. Now, there's a lot of questions you have to start to ask yourself. What was the information? You start to do analysis to say, what's the superset they could have possibly gotten? What was in that information? And data analysis is, for any of you who have done that, is a very tedious practice because while we can do things like scan and look for PII, we can look for social security numbers, applying real context to what we call confidential information in an organization is incredibly difficult. So it's hours and hours and hours of many people who it's not their day job to go through the different data and identify, well, this was financial results from 12 years ago. This was employee records from 20 years ago. Well, why is it there? And all this compounds the problem. So when these data exfiltration attacks happen, it makes it that much more challenging for organizations to respond. And the reality is the actors know this. So this isn't a ransomware-specific presentation, but ransomware and that specific attack that I articulated was the driver for the initiative that I'm about to go through. But this double extortion scheme is incredibly common. 3 years ago with Maze, we started to see that. Today, this says 89%. It's really 90-plus attacks have some level of data exfiltration component. And most of you probably know why, because the reality was the encryption-based attacks, many organizations stopped paying. They recovered from backups. They found other ways to decrypt the data. Maybe they were sloppy with the encryption algorithm where the keys were already available. So they started looking at, can we get even just the smallest amount of information out of an organization to pressure them to pay for brand, reputation, regulatory exposures. And personally, nobody should ever pay once the bad actor has your data, nobody should ever pay to get the data back, because when you're not getting the data and it's already out there, it doesn't absolve you of all of your notification obligations and so forth. But the actors are going to try their best. The other thing that happens with this is when we think about ransomware attacks, a lot of the attacks, we assume some level of sophistication. They have to get into our Active Directory. They have to manipulate group policy. They have to push out their encryption malware through all these other things that require privileged access. Think about how easy it is in your organization today to get to confidential information, just with a name and password. And what you might have access to if you search, like, say, your Microsoft SharePoint environments or your Google Drive. How many of you have done that and are surprised by the data that you see? Raise your hands. Okay, there's a few. My question wasn't well formed. But the reality is that a lot of people underestimate how easy it is to get to some of the most sensitive information in the company because it's not wrapped in an application. And again, preaching to the security choir, the smallest amount of data loss has significant consequence. So we're not talking terabytes of information here that requires public disclosure, notifications, and so forth. Even less than 100 gigs, 10 gigs of information, particularly unstructured data, can be extremely damaging to an organization, its clients, or its employees. So we do have to deal with the public disclosures, both the ones that you would make in the event of a data exfiltration, but even worse, the ones that the threat actors make when they are successful at exfiltrating data, and how do you respond to that? Notification to your regulators, especially for public companies, and data protection authorities if there's personal data involved. Notifications to your clients, your customers, your partners, your employees, anybody who's impacted by this, who are going to ask the questions of why, what, why did you have that, what's the risk to me? And then, of course, the downstream applications of indirect costs related to things like identity monitoring and identity theft, and what protections do you provide and do there. And then regardless of the sensitivity, or even the amount of data that's involved, the brand and reputational damage that happens when your name shows up in a headline. And in my scenario, interestingly enough, because the encryption didn't actually fire, there was no ransom note. We didn't know who these bad actors were until about 5 days later, when a tech journalist in Australia, checking the dark web, saw the company name on the website, and then everything starts. So again, it doesn't take much for this to have widespread impact to your organization. And when we talk about the data that they're exfiltrating, a lot of us, again, gravitate towards our structured data applications in our environments, the crown jewels, as it were, our ERP systems, our CRM systems, our HR resource and planning systems. The reality is while those are a treasure trove of information, most of the attacks aren't getting into those applications because we have MFA, conditional access, VPN connectivity. We do user access reviews on a regular basis to make sure we're not over-permissioned. We do encryption. We have a wealth of controls on these applications. But what the data that they tend to find and gravitate towards is the unstructured, the documents, the spreadsheets, the PDFs, all the things that on a day-to-day basis that we generate, many of which have significant confidentiality and restricted purposes within the organization, but also in many cases are extracted from those same systems of record. They're moving from a highly secure location to a less secure location because we need to do some sort of analysis or reconciliation or sharing of that content, either internally or externally. And according to many industry reports, 80% of the data within the enterprise is unstructured. And that includes your emails, your Slack messages, your Teams messages, and whatnot. And on average, companies are using 14 informal content repositories. What's a content repository? Anything that would have unstructured data within it. So again, I mentioned email, your channel messages, your network shares, your hard disks, your desktop. The number of files I've ever seen saved on a desktop is kind of scary. Your cloud-based storage, both authorized and unauthorized. And when I say unauthorized, these are the ones where somebody has a Dropbox backup or some other iCloud backup even. But the information is very pervasive. It tends to spread everywhere. And unstructured data is much more complex than structured when we think about how we identify it and deal with it. So if you look at a structured database, it's fairly easy to identify sensitive columns in a database or sensitive systems based on what they do. When you have a whole bunch of documents and spreadsheets and all these other things, how do you determine true sensitivity? You can do some analysis and pattern matching, and this PII element next to this number or whatever is going to give us a fairly high understanding that it might be, or a confidence level that it is sensitive information. But does that really tell the whole story? And so unstructured data, because of that inconsistency, is challenging in a breach scenario to identify exactly what the value and the impact would be. It's also, because of the very nature of a lot of what we do in our productivity suites, it's also challenged around access and management. It's less consistent because typically when you think about it, the term network share, the idea is it's open to many people. So you move data into these locations so multiple people can access it, work on it, and so forth. And now you have probably, maybe even unbeknownst to you, exposed it to everyone in your organization. So if somebody with an authenticated login now can just get to that data. And there are a lot fewer controls available to secure it. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we go deeper in. So this is a strategy. I want to, if I could bold it, I would, but it was already bolded and it just made it messy. It's a strategy. So this is something that we undertook in my prior existence, I guess I could say that, to address this problem. So coming out of a forcing function like a data breach incident and recognizing that we had this wealth of unstructured information across our network, some of which went decades back because it was a much older company, how do we start to put guardrails and containment around that problem and start to bring it in? So your mileage will vary. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I will leave ample time at the end, especially because I'm hyper-caffeinated and I always go faster than I expect to. I will leave ample time at the end for questions and we can dig a little bit deeper into some of the concepts. So first, it starts off with two primary objectives. And these are the objectives that we agreed upon. Yours might vary, but I still think fundamentally they fall into these two categories. The first is the notion of putting structure to the unstructured. So I talked about all the challenges of these documents, spreadsheets, presentations, videos, and whatever. The more understanding we can have around location, usefulness, function, ownership, and so forth, the more we can provide essentially metadata around that information to provide an understanding of how valuable it actually is to the organization and how much security it requires. It's really easy to say, well, we'll just secure it all. The challenge is, and most security teams will attest to this, it's very difficult to secure it all. And even if you thought you did, that's a point in time, and probably by tomorrow it's going to be even less secure, and you get into a notion of entropy. But if we can start to put this structure to the unstructured, which I'll talk about in a moment, that'll allow us for consistent data practices, management of that data, and ultimately security, which is what we want to have in terms of protecting the information. The second piece, and just as important in parallel, is taking an inventory of and stock of your existing data footprint, your existing inventory, and trying to shrink it as much as possible. Now that includes shrinking not only the volume of data that you have, but the locations in which it exists. This is something that we talk about asset management constantly in terms of security. Do we know where our endpoints are? Do we know what our servers are? Do we know what our cloud-based are? And a lot of times we include data in that. Well, we know our data's in applications XYZ, it's stored in these repositories. But data asset inventory is just as important. Understanding where the information that's necessary to run your business, confidential, restricted, whatever it may be, exists in your company, who has ownership and who has access to it, is just as important from a security perspective. Because I don't have to break into one of 20,000 servers if I can get a username and password and get onto somebody's Google Drive and suddenly start downloading M&A materials or employment-related information or whatever that may be. So the strategy itself really looks at, in my perspective, there's 4 principles to identify here. And the first one, and probably most important, is scope. A lot of data initiatives tend to scope very, very wide. So you consider the ocean of data that you have, and it's like we have to apply a sledgehammer to this entire problem, and it's essentially like trying to inventory the ocean. You're looking at how much water is in the ocean, how many fish are in the ocean, how many crustaceans and coral, and you're trying to do all this stuff, and eventually, inevitably, you'll get some degree of success, and then you kind of go back to the status quo, right? And we try to address this through things like policy or through security tooling that does e-discovery or data classification, but it's a very, you're pushing rope uphill at this point. But if you can refine the scope a bit further, and we're going to talk about that through engagement with stakeholders in your organization, you actually might stand a chance of saying, okay, out of this ocean of information, what are the buckets that are truly important? What are the things that I need to keep and keep securely? What are the things that are produced on a day-to-day basis that maybe I can just toss out when we're done with it? And what is the information that maybe I don't even realize is important or necessary to secure from a bad actor? In order to make this happen, you have to have a good governance strategy, so ensuring organizational support. This isn't an IT problem. It's not a records and information management problem or a legal problem. It is an organizational problem. Because not only do you have to find ways to address the data itself, you have to change behaviors and culture to then make it sustainable. So people start to use data in the right way, putting it in the right repositories, getting rid of it when they don't need it. You're going to see a lot of resistance to that. The amazing thing I found about organizations with data, there is an emotional attachment to information. There always is. And that emotional attachment often leads to a mythology of, well, I know what our policy says, but I had this one instance where this saved the company, or this saved my job, or this saved this client, or whatever it is, and that starts to spin its own mythology. And the next thing you know, they're keeping everything. And they're keeping it anywhere they can, because they know if they put it in certain locations, it's gonna go away. You have to pivot. You have to adjust that understanding. And some of that's gonna be conversations. When you talk with your senior management teams about, or your senior leaders, depending on how big your organizations are, it could be 1 or 2 people, but talk about the importance of, listen, we've got all this information, and guess what? Security on it's not great because it's really hard to contain. Here's what potentially could happen. Now help me to solve this problem. And you're going to find that there's a lot of people who misunderstand, like, well, that copy of the contract that you have in your vault, you don't need to have that because we got another copy in Salesforce, so can you get rid of that? Because that, if exposed, could be at risk. And those are educational conversations, but you have to approach it that way. Don't go in going, you're wrong, but more of, let me help you get to the same level of understanding I have, and let's figure out how we can go forward together. Third pillar on this is rationalization. So as we go through, it's rationalizing both the location of the information, consolidating, so we have an average of 14 repositories, can we get that to 10? Could we get that to 5? And there's an argument to be made that if you condense it all, it gives an opportunity for a targeted attack against that repository. But the reality is it also makes it easier to secure. If you know where it is, it's easier to put controls around that, data loss prevention, monitoring, making sure the necessary hurdles are in place to protect that information. Also, and this goes back to the emotional attachment, not being afraid to purge information. Getting rid of data is not a bad thing if you don't need it anymore, if it doesn't need to be there. And guess what? It shrinks your risk, it shrinks your attack footprint. And if you can't purge it, then consider something like archival. Can I move it from a live environment where it's easily accessible to a more secure environment that maybe requires a help desk ticket or an email to get access to, but guess what? I can put tighter controls around it until the time that we feel comfortable we can get rid of it. But these are conversations to have along the way. And then the last one is the controls component. Because as we start to identify where this information is, start to do that consolidation and rationalization, and we have this top-down support, we can now start putting in pragmatic risk-based controls related to that information that not only focuses on the security components, but linking concepts like data retention and deletion to the overall data governance strategy as part of cyber. And most of you probably don't think about data retention and data disposal things necessarily in terms of cyber, but it's a critical component. And wherever possible, working towards automation. Now, that last point, and we're going to talk about this in a moment on another slide, that last point is important. A lot of people stop because they can't find an automated way to do it. The reality is there's a lot of manual things that could be done in the interim that can get you to an automated approach. So the point is explore before you just assume you can't. So some important areas of focus as we dive deeper into each of these. From a governance perspective, the top-down piece is necessary. I found it really enlightening to have a senior management meeting where the CEO basically kind of rolled his eyes and said, why don't we just delete it all? And then the general counsel had to weigh in like, well, hold on a second, because that's not a great idea either. But having those conversations, getting that top down is important because even if you have their moment of attention for a 30-minute meeting, walking out of that, making sure that you have a data champion and change champions that are from each of those functional areas and business groups to help you align this strategy. And the reason that becomes important isn't just because of a distribution of work. It's because you need that level of engagement and understanding of how they actually use data and what they do with the data and where it goes in order for this to be effective. The worst laid schemes in data governance start with a policy and a mandate that gets pushed out. And then if it doesn't reflect how you operate, people will find ways to circumvent it, they'll go around it, and you end up back at square one. But engage at the onset and have champions identified significantly increases the success rate of these operations. The other piece is it also helps to encourage pilot participation. So again, going back to that understanding, as you're thinking about, well, how could we construct a new document library? How maybe we might manage access permissions? Or we want to review our retention policies and schedules. Getting test groups to actually try that out is important because this is as much about employee experience as it is about security in many ways. And then of course also top-down communication and awareness. There should be a steady drumbeat throughout this of the importance of this to the organization, the importance of it to the security of you, your employees, and your clients, as well as what phases we're going into and what things we're going to be doing on the go forward. I have way too many buttons up here. Retention policies. So again, this is one of the areas that ends up being kind of dangerous. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands, and I'm going to form the question better than I did last time I said this. So how many of you in your organization have a retention policy for data? Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you actually know what that retention policy says? Okay, only a few that dropped off. How many of you think it actually makes sense in terms of the way you operate? Okay. Okay, good, good. So you guys are rock stars. The rest of you, that's exactly what I expected to see. And I don't disbelieve you. I do think, though, you might be surprised when you talk to the rest of your population. So retention policies often focus on two things: compliance or e-discovery and litigation, right? So we need to keep it for tax or audit or just in case we get sued or whatever that may be. And that mythology tends to start wrapping itself around where you end up with retention policies and schedules that sometimes, how many of you have a 7-year? How many have 7 years? Okay, a few people. I've seen upwards of 50, and then some things that are permanent, right? And the reality is, it's like, do we really need to keep that for forever? Doesn't at some point in time? And those kind of things, those should be questions that you should continue to ask yourself, because the reality is the more that data you keep for the just-in-case scenarios, the more data that's potentially exposed in a cyber attack and for data exfiltration. So when you think about those policies, it's not just a legal and in records and information management discussion, it's an organization discussion that actually focuses a bit on risk tolerance and appetite. Okay, we need to keep X for these compliance reasons, got that. We'll set those aside and we'll talk about how we deal with those records in a moment. But for everything else, how aggressive can we be? What is the minimal amount of time we need to keep it? 2 years? 5 years? What's that level of comfort and what's the risk associated with keeping it for that long? And then starting with the most sensitive data that we identified in our scoping, with the engagement of the data champions, because they're going to also have some insight you don't have about what the actual sensitive data is. You'd be surprised how many things based on a data classification scheme you go talk to a finance group, and they'll tell you about stuff that you had no idea about that doesn't necessarily raise a flag, or your human resources team. It's like, well, it doesn't have PII, but it has this, and veteran status and other things of that nature. You'd be surprised. But understand where that information lives, start to evaluate your policies about how long you keep it. And I add in not only the cyber risk, but the privacy risk. Because having done privacy and data protection for quite a while as well, the reality is almost every data protection regulation has something about don't keep the data longer than you need to. But there's also a bunch of small little text underneath it that gives a whole bunch of opportunity to keep it a lot longer than you think you need to. Right? So there's exceptions for legal obligations or fulfilling services or claims, and it's amazing how many things kind of end up with well, we didn't need to get rid of it now, but now we have it forever. And nobody went back and challenged that. So consider that as well as the cyber. The other piece is, from a sustainability perspective, a lot of retention schedules, depending on the age of the organization, are almost driven more by physical records, a box at Iron Mountain, or a file cabinet somewhere. Think about how those policies apply to actual applications. If you have 25 different record types and 30 different schedules, how does an application do that? How do you automate that kind of activity? And the burden that actually puts on your IT and technology teams to try to enforce that. And then ultimately what happens is they're going to default to the longest tail. And then if that longest tail is 50 years, guess what? You got a whole bunch of information out there. And then aside from the stuff that you need to keep, which is what retention policies typically focus on, prioritize the stuff that you don't. The non-records, the unofficial records, whatever term you might have for this. Because that's the information in a lot of these data incidents. It's really going to be the stuff that gets out, but guess what? It's just as damaging and just as sensitive as all the record information, because it's often copies. It's version 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 of that final draft that actually went up somewhere. It's all the underlying calculations that actually led to your financial reporting. It's your customer list going back multiple years with how much they paid and when that might expire. If this sounds like I'm talking from experience, I am, because this is information I've seen actually in breaches. But think about, if you don't need that, put an aggressive policy around how you destroy it and how quickly you destroy it. And if you're wondering how you destroy data, Ben Rothke had a really great presentation at 8:30 this morning, God bless you, that actually showed up for that, around electronic data disposal. I recommend checking that one out. So for the official records, The approach that we took was recognizing we actually had a rubber band ball of document repositories. And the challenge with going into an existing SharePoint or existing Google Documents or whatever and trying to peel that apart is that you inherit the flaws that are already resident in the system. So what we decided to do was start greenfield and essentially say, listen, we'll still, let's create a document repository in our SharePoint environment as our system of record for unstructured data, but let's create it from scratch. Let's create a new document library with specific permissions, with specific folder structures, reflective of how the different groups work, because this is all based on data champion, change champion engagement, with the revised policies applied. And then, of course, then we can also put the necessary security models around that to make sure that access in the future is ticketed, tracked, reviewed, and so forth. It's a lot easier than trying to unwind the mess of your data. It does require a bit of a heavier lift at the onset because you have to migrate and move data from one repository to the other. And nobody has time for that, amazingly enough, until you really press that this is an imperative for the organization. But it will be the path of least resistance going forward, because you're not going to inherit all those things that exist in your current repositories. And as you migrate those, this centralization then allows for that appropriate access control, management of policy, and importantly, security configuration. There's a lot of things as we think about how our environments are configured around SharePoint and others where they're very permissive by default. And we can go into whether or not that should be the case, and there's a lot of arguments now that those default configurations should be more secure, but how many of you have probably seen a configuration where you share a document in SharePoint or Teams and it's available to anyone who has the link, right? Or anyone in the organization. Now, going back to my path of least resistance for a threat actor, if it's already available to anybody in the organization, do I really need more than just a credential to get access to it? No, right? You're making an assumption that you're in this trusted container, and now somebody's violated that trust and come in, but guess what? They can see everything. So think a lot about how those configurations are set by default. And that doesn't mean restricted to the point that you don't enable your business, but it does mean make very pragmatic, focused decisions about what you do set them to. And along the way, communication is important. We had that top-down engagement at the onset. We're working with our data champions, but this is really going to be about influencing organizational behavior widespread. Every employee ultimately will end up being impacted by this, right? And it comes down to involving them to some degree in the conversation. That doesn't mean making them a decision maker. It doesn't mean trying to get into consensus, because that will never happen. But communicate them with the importance of why we're doing this. What's the potential harm to the company? How can they be part of it? And then provide them with the tooling and the capabilities to actually participate. So understanding these are the locations where this information should be stored, these are best practices, training, videos, awareness. Also, one of the things that really helps here is as we talk about deletion of data, is helping them to dimensionalize the problem. The early reaction to hearing that data is going to be deleted at X time is, you can't do that because of what? I have too many files that are this old and I need this information. We actually just created some very basic discovery scripts that would allow people to identify based on a date and time how many files in their OneDrive exceed this threshold. And in almost all instances, it was a very small percentage of information that was actually going to be purged. And in most of those cases, it wasn't information they needed to maintain. But that visibility was enlightening to those people. It helped to demyth. We'll make that a word if it's not already, I think it is. But demyth the process for everyone involved. And then, of course, keeping this realistic. So as we think about timelines and milestones, don't be afraid to shift. If you're not getting the necessary traction, if it's not working out, you need to pivot. You have to be free to fail forward with these kinds of initiatives, because you can't anticipate everything that happens. You can't anticipate the employee experience changes, and there will always be those silos who were like, I didn't know about this. Come talk to me. So when you go home, these are the obligatory take-home slides. I think you get the whole package online. First week, really, if nothing else, have a conversation with the necessary people in your organization about this topic. And it can focus on unstructured data. It can include the data in your applications. But have a real conversation about, where is our information? How much of it's out there? Who has access? How do we use this? And how long do we keep it? Some of the conversations will probably be surprising. And then using that, evaluate your actual risk. Start to kind of dimensionalize and track that. Even if it's just a qualified measurement of where I am from an impact and likelihood kind of scale, think about that risk because that's going to give you a target to start moving it down and to the left. And then begin to identify those data and change champions in the organization that can help to make that accomplish. And again, these are primarily I would focus on human resources, legal, finance, engineering, and IT because of some system documentation and design. But don't forget your marketing folks. There's a lot of stuff that they have out there too. Your sales team have a lot of client data and a lot of client contracts. So you really have to leave no stone unturned. So while there's a tendency to prioritize these specific mystical functions that have all the critical data, the reality is everybody in the organization has something that if exposed is going to be worth damaging your organization. And then in the first 3 months, work with those champions to identify the locations of that information. This becomes important because they're going to know all the hidden places where data is kept. Those file transfer repositories that they have for one client that they drop information into so they can pick it up because it was just the way we did things. And all those different locations that are in the shadows that aren't tracked. Work with them to identify those and then also who owns that information so you can think about how you reconstitute these in a more centralized manner. Develop your plan to start shrinking your data footprint. So as you talk through this, identify the opportunities to say, listen, do we really need to keep this information longer than you've got 10 years of stuff here? And this is an older organization, so younger, let's say it's 3. But do you need it for that long? Can we get rid of it now? Maybe already shrink our data risk while we talk about the rest of it. There's opportunities there, and this is almost more of a don't take this as a waterfall approach, but be very agile in how you apply it. Ensure the configurations are in place on your critical repository. So as we start to centralize this data, the worst case scenario is moving it into something that's less secure. So once you've identified, hey, this is where we want it, make sure you double down on the configuration settings and the security settings for those environments. Make sure it reflects the risk that you have. CISA has some really good guidance, by the way, for those of you at Microsoft 365 on how you can configure all of these with really strong baseline standards. And then review your classification and retention policies. This is going to be an ongoing kind of discussion, but really challenge the mythology that's woven into those policies. If we say we keep something for X amount of years, is that necessary? And also, is it reflective of our practice? Do we really do this? Can we do this? Because this is where policy typically falls apart. People rush out with a policy. It's a copy and paste from someplace else. It's something they've seen in a prior organization, but it doesn't reflect the reality of your operations. And then last slide, and I'll open it to questions. Within 6 months, hopefully, you'd be on a journey, and it is a journey. And I'm not going to say it's a smooth sailing journey. It's a lot of ups and downs and sideways and left and right and any direction you can go into. It's the wonkavator of data governance. But you should be on a journey to start to migrate and deprecate those legacy locations, starting to get some level of centralization and footprint consolidation. Have established a strategy to, where possible, automate data retention and deletion. But if you can, at least do manual. Set up an information practice that every twice a year, notifications go out. Hey, it's time to delete your data. Anything older than this, just clear it. It's not. It seems kind of arduous, but it's effective and allows people to engage and participate. And then eventually, hopefully, you can get to an automated piece, but at least you have something. Build that organizational understanding of the importance. Also building trust, so that engagement model we talked about with the employee base and taking employee experience in mind helps to build that trust that you're actually doing something that not only benefits the organization, it actually helps them. Right? It's not done in isolation. And that trust then turns into commitment. And ultimately, you want this to be something that becomes sustainable. You don't want this to be a point-in-time exercise that you do every 10 years or so because your data's gotten out of hand. You want to try to build something that's a sustainable approach. And then lastly, once you have this in place, and this has always been a personal preference of mine, is we start with data loss prevention strategies often. We immediately start with what happens if it gets out. And because it's all pervasive and it's so fluid, it's really challenging to have an effective data loss prevention plan. But if you've gone through and you've done this level of organization, now you have some specific targets to apply those data loss prevention controls on. If I know it's going to be in these official record repositories, or I know these certain groups that use these different locations, I can tune my controls. So I'm not trying to look at everything across my network, but I can activate and trigger on activities in those specific locations when I see bad things going in and out, or adverse login activity, or whatever it may be. So again, use that to apply a sensible and pragmatic approach. And I warned you I was hypercaffeinated, but we have time for Q&A. If you do have questions, I would encourage you, because we are apparently recording, use the microphones. If you're not able to make a microphone, raise your hand and someone will come to you. So any questions? Maybe I just talked really fast. Oh, here we go. Here's one. Hi.
I'll go ahead and break. Can you hear me? Or do I need to turn
Yeah.
the mic on?
You good?
It's on? Okay, good, thanks. All right, so what if your IS team is your biggest competitor in this? You know, we talk about data governance, we talk about trying to clean things up, and then my VP of IS is like, oh, well, we're just gonna do that because it's fine. We close out those open links to anybody after 30 days, and we don't see an issue with keeping stuff for 50 years in individual systems. How do you make them a champion if they're thinking that it's totally okay?
So there's a couple different components to that. One is that organizational buy-in at the onset. Often, for lack of a better term, there's some peer pressure involved there. So if they see the importance from across the business and other functions, it lessens their ability to say, I think we're okay, right? And then the other part is to have a real conversation with them to understand their perspective. Surveys there. So understand your perspective of where you're coming from, where they're coming from, and what's that middle ground. And I've met some individuals who are more challenging than others. But the reality is, again, if you get that buy-in piece and try to meet them in the middle, it often at least allows you to move the conversation forward in a constructive manner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, got one.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. One main challenge with security, like we are IT, but the management, they are non-IT. So they are thinking about the organization overall. So I bring like these strategies and like programs to enhance the security. But sometimes the CEO or COO, they reject these programs. But when the incident happened, like cyber attack happened to the organization, they said, do what you can to solve this issue.
Right.
So how I can protect myself as IT admin or network administrator for this issue?
So the best advice I would have is to keep your eyes on the headlines. Because the reality is the justification for these kind of programs happen every day. And we see it regularly, and we see the impacts of that regularly. And not just focusing on financial loss and data protection and everything, but just brand and reputational. It takes a tremendous amount of time to rebuild trust after a data breach. Even if it's not necessarily your data or your client's data that was impacted, even if it's just a notion that you were compromised in some way. But I find that breach events, even if they're not my own, though I did have the luxury of one, are tremendous forcing functions because it forces those stakeholders in the organization who maybe aren't thinking about security to think about it in terms of risk and impact to my business.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all for showing up this morning. If you have any questions, I'll be available here. My email is also available on the slide deck, and please do complete your surveys. And again, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference.